Hello, Dumelang. Welcome back to Naming the Unspoken. I've been just reflecting on the last few episodes where I've been speaking about Blackness, identity, belonging, language, and just the experience of having to move through the different spaces and contexts that receive us differently. And in this episode, I want to continue that conversation, but move more directly into the experiences of silence around race, because I think race still, requires space for us to reflect. Okay, a real space, thoughtful space, emotional space. And I know for some people, these conversations can begin to sound repetitive. Like, are we still talking about race? Yes, we are still talking about race. And I think part of the reason these conversations keep returning is because the realities themselves keep returning. The systemic realities, the historical realities, the emotional realities, especially in professional spaces, especially in institutions, and especially in spaces where many people still feel they must constantly manage themselves in order to be seen or to belong. And I think the previous episode touched something important for me, this question of shrinking, making oneself smaller in certain spaces. A few people have just been in conversation with me regarding that particular episode, just around their experiences of the hard work, the labor, the emotional labor, or intellectual labor that goes into managing these spaces. And just, I think, having these conversations and hearing from people around this particular topic just really emphasizes the need to be creating spaces for some of us who do not have the luxury to avoid race. So I want to just think about that with you. Think about how we try perhaps to make ourselves smaller or softer or more careful or more digestible to the environments that we find ourselves in. I know that many people carry that experience quietly at work, in boardrooms, in corporate, in universities, in training programs or academic spaces. Just spaces where you begin calculating how much of myself is acceptable, how direct can I be, how emotional am I sounding, how much truth can this room tolerate. And often what develops around all of that is silence. Sometimes the spaces themselves are silent around race or racial experiences, or sometimes we speak up in these spaces and then we are silenced. So there's something about silence around race, a particular kind of silence. The kind of silence that enters certain rooms when race appears. I think many of us know the silence. You feel it when a conversation suddenly becomes careful, when people begin choosing their words differently. You can almost hear when people are editing themselves in real time, or just people fall silent. When tension quietly enters the room, when people look away or laugh nervously, that little laugh people do when they desperately want the topic to move on. And I've been wondering, what is actually happening in those moments? Because silence is never just silence. Silence can be quite loud. It is not neutral. It is not empty. It carries something, often carries a lot. So something is happening underneath it. And I think that many of us feel that, even when we cannot fully explain it. You may leave certain conversations or spaces or encounters at work, for example, feeling heavy or feeling unsettled or feeling strangely exhausted, even though technically, and I put this in quotes, nothing happened. I put it in quotes because something did actually happen emotionally, more abstractly, or in a nuanced way. Have you ever experienced that? Walked out of a room and realized something important was happening emotionally, but no one actually named it. I've noticed that conversations about race can change the emotional atmosphere of a room very quickly, sometimes instantly. One moment people are relaxed and the next moment something just shifts. The body tenses, people become careful. Suddenly everyone sounds like they're writing an email to HR. So the energy changes and everybody feels it, but often nobody names it. So I sometimes wonder how many professional spaces are organized around managing racial discomfort quietly, not resolving it, addressing it, not understanding it, just managing it, or even dismissing it. So, but really trying to keep things functional enough to continue, keeping things polite enough to avoid any rupture. Have you ever sat in a meeting and felt tension enter the room, but watched everybody continue speaking as though nothing happened? That's such a strange experience, right? For something to be happening and nobody names it. Everybody feels it, and yet somehow we all continue as though nothing happened. And maybe these happenings are around microaggressions or aggressions that are not so micro, but something around just race having entered the room and nothing gets named or said. And perhaps when it is named or something is said, it may be dismissive. Can we move on from this quickly? So I think that many of us have become very skilled at sensing the emotional shifts in rooms, especially those of us who spend our lives navigating racialized spaces. You learn to notice, you notice facial expressions, discomfort, you notice silence, you notice defensiveness. You learn to feel when a room opens and when it closes. You even learn to to notice when, when you are not being seen or when you've become invisible. Sometimes you may even be having two conversations at once. The actual conversation with, a colleague, but then you're also having an internal one with yourself. And maybe that internal one is going along the lines of, what just happened here? How am I being received? Or that was inappropriate. Or have I said too much? Or am I becoming too visible? Or just noting perhaps the inappropriateness of what's happening around race. Have you ever replayed a racial conversation in your head afterwards and rehearsed it again later and thought, maybe I should have said that differently? Or I should have probably said something about this because it was not okay. Or maybe I shouldn't have said anything at all. And so it goes, that internal dialogue afterwards, just playing it over and over and over again. But you know that something happened inside of you. You know that something shifted in you. You know that you've been impacted, but you can't find the words for it. You can't quite put it into a language that at least another person might be able to understand. But it's there. It's happening silently, but very impactful. So that moment where conversation may suddenly become emotionally charged, even though very little has actually been said. And I think that race often does that, not because race itself is the problem, but because race carries history and this history continues to be alive. And I think that all of that still continues to enter the rooms with us, whether we acknowledge it or not, and whether the environment, the space acknowledges it or not. So I've been thinking a lot about what silence protects, because I don't think people are always silent because they don't care. Sometimes people are silent because they are afraid. And when I say people, I mean Black and non-Black alike. Perhaps they silence because people are afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid of offending someone, afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of sounding racist, afraid of conflict, afraid of shame. And I think many people know that feeling, especially in conversations about race. Just that feeling of becoming hyper aware of your words, hyper aware of yourself. Wondering, can I say this? Will this come out wrong? Will I hurt someone? Will I expose myself? And sometimes silence then begins to feel safer than speech. And I think that's what I keep returning to, the relationship between silence and safety, because sometimes silence protects connection or coherence or wanting to survive a particular space. But I think that sometimes silence also protects systems that can be racially violent. And it can protect comfort, and it can protect avoidance. And I wonder how often institutions remain emotionally unchanged because certain truths never fully enter language. But I also think silence protects us from something else. and that's vulnerability. Because to really speak honestly about race requires emotional exposure. It requires allowing yourself to be seen. And I think many of us are not used to that kind of exposure. So there's something around safety, or perhaps you may have had the experience of having spoken and the consequence of having done so may have been traumatizing. So you may have learned that to say something leads to negative consequences, for example. And so you think, let me not disturb the room. Let me not become too much. Let me keep things manageable. So you might try to edit yourself professionally, not because you were wrong, but because you knew honesty would change how people saw you. Have you ever done that? Stayed silent to maintain connection, peace, protect yourself. Because staying silent, or rather speaking, may have felt too risky. Staying silent because you knew the room could not hold what you really wanted to say. The room could not hold your rage, perhaps. I think one of the difficult things about conversations on race is that they often involve enormous emotional labor, especially for people of color, especially for Black people. Because sometimes you are not only speaking, you are also managing the emotions of the room. You are managing discomfort, you're managing defensiveness, you're managing guilt, you're managing tension. And that can become very exhausting. Sometimes when you have become vulnerable or you have spoken up, people might acknowledge and, thank you for your bravery. And while that may be genuine, there's also something sad about needing courage simply to describe your reality. So, silence is information. It tells you a lot. It tells you a lot about what's happening inside of you. I think it also tells you a lot about what's happening in the room. It's not absence. It's information. It can tell us, I think silence can tell us where fear lives, where shame lives, where guilt lives, where history lives, and also maybe where vulnerability becomes difficult. And maybe learning to listen differently is part of the work. So perhaps the question is not simply, why are we silent? Maybe the deeper question is, what is the silence trying to protect? And what becomes possible if we try to remain present long enough to listen beneath it? And in the next episode, I want to move more directly into the question of speech. What happens when somebody finally says the thing everybody has been avoiding? Is it actually safe to speak about race honestly? And I think there's a lot to say around safety. So reflect with me, stay with me, and I will be back on the next episode. Lesedi Kganya.